These are the notes from the second part of the chapter on Georgia's modern civil rights movement. After World War II, there was more outspoken opposition among African Americans to the Jim Crow laws. We've talked about this before. They were unwilling to have served honorably in World War II and then come home and serve as second-class citizens. So they were more willing to speak out. More chapters of the NAACP were formed. This is the charter for the Columbus, Georgia chapter. This looks like it's dated 1939. The second name on the list is T.H. Brewer. He was a doctor in Columbus who began to organize local African Americans to challenge the system. He was a founding member of the Columbus chapter of the NAACP. He also helped support Primus King in his lawsuit against Georgia's all-white primary. He was killed in 1956 after threats from the KKK. He was shot in downtown Columbus. If you're interested, there's a very good article in the New Georgia Encyclopedia. You can take a look at that. Buses were one of the facts of segregated life that were challenged fairly early on. You all know about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her bus seat on a city bus in Montgomery in 1955. She was arrested, and Montgomery's black community began a bus boycott. They were the main users of the city bus system. So they began to boycott, refusing to ride until they could sit anywhere. After a year of this boycott, the courts ordered the buses to be desegregated. In 1957, Atlanta's black ministers planned a similar bus boycott, but by January of 59, the courts had ruled in their favor. Atlanta Mayor Hartsfield, we've already heard several things about him in his response to the bombing of the Hebrew Benevolent Congregation. But he worked with black and white leaders to desegregate the school system of Atlanta in 1961. In class, we'll take a look at a Georgia stories about some of the protests that went on in Atlanta. Let's take a look at some of the leaders of the modern civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the founders of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC. It urged nonviolent methods of protest. Andrew Young joined the staff in 1961. He was very young when he joined. Dr. Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College, was a supporter of nonviolent protest and a mentor to many of the young men in the movement, like Dr. King, Julian Bond, and Maynard Jackson. College students were involved in these protests. So they're 19, 20 years old, not that much older than you. In February of 1960, 4 students staged the first sit-in at a lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. A sit-in is a demonstration where people enter a public building and refuse to leave until they are served or their demands are met. It is a kind of civil disobedience. In March of 1960 and early 61, lunch counter sit-ins in Atlanta took place, and those counters were desegregated in the fall of 61. In 1960, a woman named Ella Baker worked with college students to form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. Some of the first members were Julian Bond and John Lewis, who were in college and 19 or 20, very, very young. John Lewis is currently a U.S. congressman from the Atlanta area. In 1961, it's called the Summer of Freedom Rides, or the Freedom Riders. Integrated buses, black and white people, would leave Washington, D.C., and travel throughout the South, making the point that buses should be integrated. They met with violence. John Lewis was beaten coming off of one bus in a bus station. In 1961, there was an effort to desegregate facilities in Albany, Georgia. Dr. King led it, but it was not as successful as some had hoped. And lots of people look at the Albany movement as something that Dr. King learned from. We'll talk about why it wasn't a success in class. One of the things that does come out of the Albany movement is the Freedom Singers. And they went on to be an integral part of protest after that. In 1963, horrified Americans watched Birmingham police use dogs and fire hoses on unarmed protesters. This was on the nightly news. Very quickly after that, President Kennedy calls for civil rights legislation. In August of 63, the March on Washington happens. 250,000 Americans marched to the Lincoln Memorial, and Dr. King delivers his most famous speech. We'll listen to all of it at some point in class. Just another month later, there is a bombing at the 16th Street Baptist Church. 4 girls who are down in the church basement getting ready to sing in the church choir are killed. Another month later, Kennedy is assassinated. Johnson, who's now the president, pushes forward the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This made segregation and discrimination in public places illegal, and it outlawed discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. Now, there was resistance to civil rights. We've already talked about some of those things. Massive resistance by whites against the idea of school desegregation. Um, Changing the Georgia flag was an example of the Georgia legislature doing something to protest. But it was everyday people resisted, some violently. Medgar Evers was murdered in Mississippi in 1963, a teenager. 3 men working on voter registration drives, 1 black, 2 white, are murdered in Mississippi in 1964. The movie Mississippi Burning is about this incident. Here in Georgia, this guy, Lieutenant Colonel Lemuel Penn, was murdered in Madison County, Georgia, on the way home to Washington, D.C. from Fort Benning. They had left Fort Benning and were driving north, and he was lynched in Madison County, Georgia. In 1965, voter registration drives continue. There's the Selma to Montgomery March, which we just had the 50th anniversary just a few months ago. Marchers are crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge. State troopers attack. John Lewis is beaten unconscious at that incident. After that, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. It ensured that every citizen could vote. Now, what was the impact of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act? The major impact was that African Americans began to influence elections and be elected to office. Julian Bond was elected to the Georgia House of Representatives. Andrew Young, in 1972, was elected as a U.S. congressman. Later, he was appointed ambassador to the UN by President Carter. In 1981, he was elected mayor of Atlanta, and he helped bring the 1996 Olympics to Atlanta, like you heard in Claire's speech just the other day. Maynard Jackson was elected mayor of Atlanta in 1973, the first black mayor of a major southern city. He helped improve economic opportunities for minorities and served 3 terms in all, also helping bring the Olympics to Atlanta. And that's it for this chapter.